The morning sun cast long shadows across the cobblestone courtyard of Buckingham Palace as tourists gathered behind the familiar red ropes. Among them stood Marcus Wellington, a man whose expensive Italian suit and diamond-encrusted watch spoke louder than his voice ever could. At 45, Marcus had built a fortune in tech investments, and he carried himself with the swagger of someone who believed money could buy him anything, including respect. Marcus adjusted his gold-rimmed sunglasses and checked his Rolex for the third time in 5 minutes. He had flown from New York specifically to see the changing of the Guard ceremony, not out of genuine interest in British tradition, but because his wealthy friends back home had mentioned it as a must-see tourist attraction. To Marcus, this was just another item to check off his list of expensive experiences. The crowd around him buzzed with excitement as families from different countries pointed their cameras toward the palace gates. Children sat on their parents' shoulders, elderly couples held hands while sharing stories of their first visit to London, and young backpackers clutched their guidebooks with enthusiasm. But Marcus remained unmoved by the collective anticipation. He pulled out his phone and began making loud business calls, speaking about million-dollar deals while other visitors tried to enjoy the peaceful morning atmosphere. Standing perfectly still near the palace entrance was Guardsman James Morrison, a 28-year-old soldier who had served his country with distinction for over 8 years. James wore the iconic red tunic and tall black bearskin hat that made the Queen's Guard instantly recognizable around the world. His polished black boots reflected the morning light, and his rifle stood at his side in the traditional position. Behind his stoic expression lay years of rigorous training, unwavering discipline, and deep pride in his role as a protector of the British monarchy. James had grown up in a small town in Yorkshire, where his grandfather had told him stories of brave soldiers who served the crown with honor. From a young age, James dreamed of joining the Queen's Guard, inspired by tales of their dedication and sacrifice. He had endured months of intense physical and mental training to earn his position, learning not just military skills but also the profound responsibility that came with wearing the uniform. The ceremony was scheduled to begin in 30 minutes, and James maintained his vigilant watch over the growing crowd. He had learned to tune out the constant chatter of tourists, the clicking of cameras, and the occasional inappropriate comment. His training had taught him to remain completely motionless and silent, no matter what distractions occurred around him. This discipline was not just for show. It represented centuries of military tradition and the solemn duty to protect the royal family and their residents. Marcus finished his phone call and noticed the guard standing nearby. A mischievous smile crossed his face as he turned to his companion, Sarah, a social media influencer he had hired to document his European vacation. Sarah was busy setting up her professional camera equipment, preparing to capture content for her millions of followers who eagerly watched her travel adventures with wealthy clients. "Watch this," Marcus whispered to Sarah, loud enough for nearby tourists to hear. "I bet I can make that statue move. These guys are supposed to be completely emotionless, right? Let's see how professional he really is." Sarah looked uncomfortable with Marcus's suggestion. She had worked with many wealthy clients during her career, but something about Marcus's attitude toward the guard made her uneasy. "Maybe we should just enjoy the ceremony," she suggested quietly. "These soldiers take their job very seriously." But Marcus was already walking toward James, his expensive leather shoes clicking against the stone pavement. The crowd began to notice his approach, and several people pulled out their phones, sensing that something interesting was about to happen. Parents pulled their children closer, while other tourists whispered among themselves about the approaching confrontation. Marcus stopped just inches from James's face, close enough that the guard could smell his expensive cologne, mixed with the arrogance that seemed to surround him like an invisible cloud. James's training kicked in automatically. His breathing remained steady, his eyes focused straight ahead and his posture unchanged. He had dealt with disrespectful tourists before, but something about this man's demeanor suggested this encounter might be different from the usual attempts to make him laugh or move. "Hey there, toy soldier," Marcus said loudly, his voice carrying across the courtyard. "I'm talking to you. Don't you know who I am? I could probably buy this entire palace with my credit card." The crowd fell silent, shocked by Marcus's blatant disrespect. Several tourists began recording the interaction, Sensing that they were witnessing something that would likely go viral on social media, an elderly British gentleman shook his head in disgust, while a mother covered her young daughter's ears to shield her from Marcus's inappropriate behavior. James remained motionless, but inside he felt a familiar fire burning. He had encountered entitled tourists before, but rarely had someone shown such blatant disrespect for the uniform he wore with pride. His grandfather's voice echoed in his mind, reminding him of the honor and dignity that came with serving the crown. This was more than just a job. It was a sacred duty that connected him to generations of brave soldiers who had stood in the same position. Marcus reached into his wallet and pulled out a thick stack of $100 bills. He waved the money in front of James's face, the crisp bills rustling in the morning breeze. "Come on, I know you guys don't make much money standing around here all day. This is probably more cash than you see in a month. All you have to do is salute me and tell everyone here that I'm important." The crowd gasped at Marcus's audacious display. Several tourists began voicing their disapproval, with one elderly woman shouting, "That's absolutely disgraceful," but Marcus seemed to feed off the attention, his smile growing wider as he realized he had become the center of everyone's focus. Sarah lowered her camera, unable to continue filming what had become an embarrassing spectacle. She had built her career on showcasing luxury experiences, but this was crossing a line that made her question her association with Marcus. The atmosphere in the courtyard had shifted from excited anticipation to uncomfortable tension, as everyone waited to see how the situation would unfold. James continued to stand perfectly still, but the tension in his jaw betrayed the emotional storm brewing beneath his calm exterior. Years of military training had prepared him for many situations, but the combination of public humiliation and blatant disrespect toward his uniform was testing every ounce of his self-control. The money fluttering in front of his face represented everything he had been taught to resist: the corruption of duty, the abandonment of honor, and the betrayal of trust placed in him by his country. Marcus grew frustrated by the guard's lack of response. He was accustomed to getting immediate reactions from people, whether through his wealth, his connections, or his aggressive personality. The silence from James only fueled his determination to provoke a response. He stepped even closer, now so near that his breath fogged James's polished brass buttons. "You know what your problem is?" Marcus continued, his voice growing louder and more aggressive. "You people think you're so special with your fancy uniforms and your traditions. But at the end of the day, you're just minimum-wage security guards playing dress-up for tourists like me." The crowd around them had grown larger as word spread through the courtyard about the confrontation. Tourists who had been admiring other parts of the palace grounds hurried over to witness the spectacle. Many were recording with their phones, while others looked on in horror at Marcus's behavior. A group of American tourists shook their heads in embarrassment, clearly ashamed that one of their countrymen was behaving so poorly. Sarah finally found her voice and approached Marcus cautiously. "Marcus, I think we should go," she whispered urgently. "You're making a scene, and this isn't the kind of content my followers want to see." But Marcus brushed off her concerns with a dismissive wave. He was completely absorbed in his attempt to break the guard's composure, viewing it as a personal challenge that he was determined to win. His business success had always come from pushing boundaries and refusing to take no for an answer, and he applied the same aggressive tactics to this situation. "Look around you," Marcus shouted, gesturing toward the crowd. "All these people are watching because they want to see what happens when someone with real power challenges your little charade. They know I could make one phone call and have you fired from this joke of a job." James's breathing remained steady, but his mind was racing. He thought about his fellow guardsmen who had served before him, many of whom had faced far greater challenges than an obnoxious tourist. He remembered the stories his sergeant had told about guards who had stood their posts during bombing raids, who had protected the royal family during assassination attempts, and who had maintained their dignity in the face of genuine threats to national security. An elderly British man in the crowd stepped forward, his walking cane tapping against the stone pavement. He wore a military medal on his jacket lapel, indicating his own service to the country. "Young man," he called out to Marcus, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had earned the right to speak. "That soldier represents something far more valuable than whatever money you're waving around. Show some respect." Marcus turned toward the elderly veteran with a sneer. "And who are you supposed to be? Another museum piece? "This is between me and Toy Soldier here." He turned back to James, his frustration evident in his reddening face. "Fine, if money doesn't work, maybe embarrassment will." Without warning, Marcus reached toward James's bearskin hat, attempting to knock it from his head. This was a sacred piece of military equipment, representing not just James's individual service but the collective honor of his entire regiment. The hat had been worn by guardsmen for over 2 centuries through wars, ceremonies, and countless hours of faithful service. But Marcus's hand never reached its target. In one fluid motion that was almost too quick for the crowd to follow, James shifted his position slightly, causing Marcus to lose his balance. The wealthy tourist stumbled forward, his expensive shoes slipping on the smooth stone pavement. His arms windmilled wildly as he tried to regain his footing, but gravity had already taken control. Marcus crashed to the ground with a sound that echoed across the courtyard, his suit jacket tearing on the rough stone. The stack of money in his hand scattered across the pavement, $100 bills fluttering away in the morning breeze. Several tourists rushed to grab the loose cash, while others simply stared in shock at the sudden turn of events. James immediately returned to his original position, standing perfectly still as if nothing had happened. His face showed no emotion, no satisfaction, no acknowledgement of what had just occurred. To any observer, it would appear that Marcus had simply been clumsy and fallen on his own, with the guard having no involvement in the incident whatsoever. The crowd erupted in a mixture of gasps, nervous laughter, and scattered applause. The elderly veteran nodded approvingly while Sarah rushed to help Marcus to his feet. His face was flushed with embarrassment and anger as he brushed dirt from his expensive suit and realized that his moment of dominance had backfired spectacularly. "You did that on purpose," Marcus shouted at James, pointing an accusing finger at the motionless guard. "Everyone saw what happened. You deliberately made me fall." But James remained silent and still, offering no response to the accusation. Several tourists in the crowd exchanged knowing glances, but none could honestly say they had seen the guard move or do anything that could be considered aggressive. The security cameras positioned around the courtyard would later show nothing more than a tourist losing his balance near a perfectly professional soldier. A palace security officer approached the scene, having been alerted by the commotion. He was a middle-aged man with the bearing of someone who had dealt with difficult situations many times before. His uniform was different from James's, more modern and practical, designed for security work rather than ceremonial duties. "Is there a problem here?" The security officer asked, his tone professional but firm. His eyes quickly assessed the situation, taking in Marcus's disheveled appearance, the scattered money, and the crowd of onlookers with their phones still recording. Marcus saw this as his opportunity for vindication. "Yes, there's a problem," he declared loudly. "Your guard here assaulted me. I want him arrested, fired, and charged with assault. I have witnesses and everything was recorded." The security officer looked at James, who continued to stand at attention, showing no signs of having moved from his post. "Guardsman Morrison," the officer said formally, "did you leave your position or make any physical contact with this gentleman?" "No, sir," James replied in a clear, steady voice. It was the first time he had spoken since the confrontation began, and his words carried the weight of absolute truth. "I have maintained my post as instructed, sir." The security officer nodded and turned back to Marcus. "Sir, I'm going to need to ask you to step back from the guard and allow him to continue his duties. If you have a complaint to file, you can do so at the visitor center." Marcus's face grew even redder as he realized that no one was taking his side in the situation. The crowd was clearly sympathetic to the guard, and even his hired companion Sarah was looking at him with obvious disapproval. His attempt to humiliate a soldier had instead resulted in his own public embarrassment, and the irony was not lost on the watching tourists. Marcus stood there fuming, his expensive suit now wrinkled and stained with dirt from his fall. The $100 bills that had been his weapon of choice were now scattered across the courtyard, with several tourists having picked them up and looking uncertainly about what to do with the money. The irony of the situation was becoming clear to everyone present. The man who had tried to use his wealth to buy respect was now literally watching his money blow away in the wind. The security officer maintained his professional demeanor while observing Marcus's increasingly agitated state. "Sir, I understand you're upset, but I need you to calm down and step away from the guard. You're creating a disturbance that's affecting other visitors' enjoyment of the palace grounds. creating a disturbance? Marcus exploded. I'm the victim here. This is assault. This is discrimination against Americans. This is... He struggled to find words that would adequately express his outrage while simultaneously trying to salvage his dignity. In front of the growing crowd, Sarah finally gathered the courage to intervene more directly. She had built her social media career on showcasing luxury experiences and positive interactions with her wealthy clients. But Marcus's behavior was threatening to damage her reputation. "Marcus, please," she said quietly, trying to guide him away from the guard. "Let's go get some coffee and talk about this privately." But Marcus shrugged off her attempts to lead him away. He was far too invested in the confrontation to back down now, especially with dozens of people recording every moment. In his mind, retreating would be an admission of defeat, and his ego simply wouldn't allow that outcome. The elderly veteran who had spoken earlier approached the group, his military bearing evident despite his advanced age. "Officer," he said to the security guard, "I've been watching this entire situation unfold. That young guardsman hasn't moved so much as an inch from his post. This gentleman simply lost his footing, and now he's trying to blame the soldier for his own clumsiness." Several other tourists nodded in agreement, and a woman with a British accent called out, "We all saw what happened. The guard did nothing wrong." The crowd was clearly turning against Marcus, with many people expressing their disgust at his treatment of the soldier. Marcus realized that public opinion was strongly against him, but instead of backing down, he doubled down on his accusations. "You're all covering for him because he's one of yours," he shouted. "This is exactly the kind of anti-American sentiment I expected to find here." The irony of his statement was immediately apparent to everyone listening. Marcus had come to Britain as a tourist, supposedly to appreciate the culture and traditions, but he had shown nothing but contempt for both the country and its customs. His accusation of anti-American sentiment rang hollow, when his own behavior had been so deliberately offensive. James continued to stand perfectly still throughout the entire exchange, but internally he was reflecting on the situation. He had encountered difficult tourists before, but Marcus represented something different, a level of entitlement and disrespect that went beyond simple ignorance or cultural misunderstanding. This was deliberate provocation, an attempt to use wealth and privilege to humiliate someone who had dedicated his life to service and honor. The security officer decided that the situation needed to be de-escalated before it spiraled further out of control. "Sir," he said to Marcus, "I'm going to give you two options. You can either move away from the guard and enjoy the rest of your visit to the palace, or I can escort you off the premises. The choice is yours." Marcus looked around at the crowd of disapproving faces, the scattered money that represented his failed attempt at bribery, and the completely unmoved guard who had somehow managed to turn the tables without appearing to do anything at all. For the first time since the confrontation began, he seemed to realize that he was not going to win this battle. "This isn't over," Marcus muttered, though his words lacked the conviction they had carried earlier. He began walking away from James, but he couldn't resist one final attempt to assert his dominance. "I'll be speaking to your superiors about this incident. I have connections that go very high up in your government." The elderly veteran chuckled at this threat. "Good luck with that, son," he called after Marcus. "I suspect you'll find that our military takes protecting the honor of their soldiers quite seriously." As Marcus and Sarah walked away, the crowd began to disperse, but many people lingered to take photos with James, who had returned to his ceremonial duties as if nothing had happened. The contrast between his dignified professionalism and Marcus's childish tantrum had not been lost on anyone who witnessed the encounter. Sarah caught up with Marcus near the palace gates, her professional equipment weighing heavily on her shoulders. "Marcus, what was that all about?" she asked, genuine confusion in her voice. "Why did you feel the need to provoke that soldier?" Marcus straightened his tie and tried to regain some composure. "It was a test," he said, though his explanation sounded weak even to his own ears. "I wanted to see if all the stories about British military discipline were true." "And what did you learn?" Sarah asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. Marcus was quiet for a long moment, watching as more tourists gathered around the guard he had just finished harassing. The soldier continued to stand perfectly still, showing no signs of the confrontation that had just occurred. If anything, he seemed to have gained even more respect from the crowd. who now viewed him not just as a ceremonial figure, but as someone who had handled a difficult situation with remarkable professionalism. "I learned," Marcus said slowly, "that some things can't be bought." But even as he spoke these words, Marcus's mind was already working on his next move. He was not the type of person to accept defeat gracefully, and the public humiliation he had just experienced was eating away at his pride. He pulled out his phone and began making calls, trying to reach contacts who might be able to help him file a formal complaint against the guard. Meanwhile, back at his post, James reflected on the encounter. He had been trained to handle all types of situations, but Marcus had tested his resolve in a way that few tourists ever had. The attempted bribery, the personal insults, and the physical aggression had all been designed to break his composure and force him to abandon his duty. But James had held firm, not just because of his training, but because of something deeper, a genuine respect for the uniform he wore and the traditions it represented. The bearskin hat on his head had been worn by soldiers who had faced enemy fire, who had protected the royal family through times of war and peace, and who had upheld the honor of their regiment through countless challenges. The morning sun was now higher in the sky, and the official changing of the guard ceremony was about to begin. James could hear the distant sound of military bands preparing for the formal procession, a reminder that his individual encounter with Marcus was just a small part of a much larger tradition that had endured for centuries. The sound of approaching military bands grew louder as the official changing of the guard ceremony prepared to commence. Tourists who had witnessed the earlier confrontation began positioning themselves for better views, many of them casting admiring glances toward James, who had become something of a hero in their eyes. The incident with Marcus had transformed what would have been a routine, ceremonial viewing into a memorable demonstration of military professionalism under pressure. James heard the familiar cadence of marching boots on stone as his replacement unit approached. The changing of the guard was more than just a tourist attraction. It was a precise military operation that had been performed with clockwork accuracy for generations. Each movement was choreographed, each step measured, and each soldier knew exactly when and how to execute their role in the ceremony. As the new guards marched into position, James felt a sense of pride that went beyond personal satisfaction. He had upheld the honor of his regiment during a challenging encounter, maintaining the dignity and professionalism that tourists from around the world came to witness. The confrontation with Marcus had actually reinforced why these traditions mattered. They represented something permanent and noble in a world that often seemed chaotic and unprincipled. Meanwhile, Marcus and Sarah had retreated to a nearby cafe, where Marcus was frantically making phone calls to anyone who might listen to his complaints. His voice carried across the small restaurant as he recounted his version of events to various contacts back in New York, each telling growing more dramatic than the last. "You should have seen the way that soldier attacked me," Marcus said into his phone, completely ignoring the fact that multiple witnesses and video recordings contradicted his account. "It was completely unprovoked. I was just trying to take a photo and he deliberately knocked me to the ground." Sarah sat across from him, stirring her coffee nervously and checking her phone for messages from her social media followers. The videos of Marcus's confrontation with the guard were already beginning to circulate online, and the comments were overwhelmingly critical of Marcus's behavior. Her professional reputation was built on showcasing positive luxury experiences, and this incident threatened to damage her carefully cultivated image. "Marcus," she said quietly, "maybe you should consider that people might see this differently than you do. The videos make it look like you were harassing the guard, not the other way around." But Marcus was too deep into his narrative to consider alternative perspectives. He had convinced himself that he was the victim of an unprovoked attack, and he was determined to seek justice through whatever channels he could access. His wealth had always allowed him to shape situations to his advantage, and he couldn't accept that this time might be different. Back at the palace, the changing of the guard ceremony proceeded with its usual precision and pageantry. The tourists who had witnessed the earlier incident found themselves paying closer attention to the individual soldiers, having gained a new appreciation for the dedication required to maintain such discipline and professionalism. Children who had seen James stand firm against Marcus's provocations now looked at all the guards with something approaching awe. An American family approached the area where James had been standing, and the father pointed out the spot to his young son. "You see, Tommy," he explained, "that's where we saw a real soldier show us what honor looks like. That man in the fancy suit tried to make the guard break his discipline, but he stood strong." The boy nodded solemnly, clearly impressed by the story. "Was the guard scared, Dad?" he asked. "No, son," his father replied. "He was brave. And being brave doesn't mean you're not scared. It means you do the right thing, even when it's difficult." This conversation was repeated in various forms throughout the crowd as parents used the incident as a teaching moment for their children. The confrontation that Marcus had intended as a display of his own power had instead become a lesson in integrity and professionalism for hundreds of observers. James, now off duty, changed out of his ceremonial uniform in the guards' quarters. His fellow soldiers had already heard about the incident through the military communication network, and they greeted him with a mixture of respect and good-natured ribbing. "So Morrison," called out Sergeant Williams, a veteran guardsman with 15 years of experience, "I hear you had an interesting morning. Tell me you didn't actually touch the bloke." James smiled as he hung up his red tunic with care. "Didn't lay a finger on him, Sarge. He managed to fall down all by himself." The other guards laughed, understanding exactly what had happened without needing detailed explanations. They had all encountered difficult tourists during their service, and they knew that sometimes the best response was simply to maintain their position and let troublemakers defeat themselves. "The important thing," Sergeant Williams continued, "is that you upheld the dignity of the regiment. That uniform represents something bigger than any individual soldier, and you protected that tradition today." James nodded, understanding the deeper meaning behind his sergeant's words. The Queen's Guard wasn't just about standing still and looking impressive for tourists. It was about maintaining a connection to centuries of military service and sacrifice. Every soldier who wore the uniform was responsible for preserving that legacy for future generations. Meanwhile, Marcus had finally reached someone in his contact network who agreed to listen to his complaints. Richard Pemberton was a British businessman with whom Marcus had some previous dealings, and he had connections within various government departments. "Richard, I need your help," Marcus said urgently into his phone. "I was assaulted by one of the Queen's Guards today, and I need to file a formal complaint. This can't be allowed to stand." Richard listened patiently to Marcus's account of events, but his response was not what Marcus had expected. "Marcus, old boy," he said carefully, "are you absolutely certain that's how it happened? The Queen's Guard are trained to never break protocol, and they're under constant observation. If one of them actually assaulted a tourist, it would be an unprecedented incident." "That's exactly why this is so serious," Marcus insisted. "This guard obviously thought he could get away with it because of his position. But I have witnesses, I have video evidence, and I'm not going to let this slide." Richard was quiet for a moment before responding. "Marcus, I'm going to give you some advice as a friend. These soldiers are held in very high regard here in Britain. If you're going to make accusations against one of them, you'd better be absolutely certain of your facts. The video evidence you mention, have you actually reviewed it?" Marcus felt a flicker of uncertainty for the first time since the incident. He had been so focused on his outrage and his desire for revenge that he hadn't actually examined the recordings that multiple tourists had made. In his mind, the videos would clearly show the guard attacking him, but Richard's question made him wonder if the evidence might be less clear-cut than he had assumed. "I don't need to review anything," Marcus said, though his voice lacked its earlier conviction. "I know what happened to me." "Of course," Richard replied diplomatically. "But if you're planning to pursue this officially, you might want to have your legal team review all available evidence first, just to make sure your case is as strong as possible." After ending the call, Marcus sat in silence for several minutes, staring at his phone. For the first time since the confrontation, he was beginning to consider the possibility that his version of events might not align with objective reality. The confident certainty that had driven his outrage was starting to crack, replaced by a growing sense of unease about what the videos might actually show. Sarah noticed Marcus's sudden silence and decided this might be the right moment to address what had really happened. She pulled out her professional camera and began reviewing the footage she had captured before the confrontation escalated beyond her comfort level. "Marcus," she said gently, "I think you should see this." She turned the camera's display screen toward him, showing the high-definition video she had recorded. The footage was crystal clear, capturing every moment of the encounter from multiple angles due to her professional equipment setup. Marcus watched himself approach the guard, saw his aggressive posturing, heard his own voice making insulting comments about the soldier's service and attempting to bribe him with cash. What struck Marcus most forcefully was seeing his own behavior from an outside perspective. The man on the screen looked nothing like the confident businessman he imagined himself to be. Instead, he saw someone who appeared petty, aggressive, and deeply disrespectful. The guard, by contrast, maintained perfect composure and dignity throughout the entire encounter. The moment of his fall was captured in slow-motion clarity. Marcus could see that the guard had made the slightest adjustment to his position, so minimal that it would have been invisible to casual observers, but the movement had been enough to cause Marcus to lose his balance when he reached for the soldier's hat. There had been no push, no strike, no aggressive action of any kind. James had simply shifted his weight slightly, and Marcus's own aggressive momentum had done the rest. "Oh," Marcus said quietly, the word escaping from him like air from a deflating balloon. The video evidence was undeniable, and it completely contradicted the narrative he had been constructing in his mind about being the victim of an unprovoked attack. Sarah fast-forwarded through the rest of the footage, showing Marcus arguing with the security officer, making accusations that were clearly false, and generally making a spectacle of himself in front of dozens of disgusted tourists. The contrast between his behavior and the guard's professionalism was stark and embarrassing. "How many people do you think recorded this?" Marcus asked, though he dreaded the answer. "Pretty much everyone who was there," Sarah replied honestly. "It's probably already online in dozens of different versions. The incident was too dramatic for people not to share it." Marcus pulled out his own phone and began searching social media platforms for any mention of the confrontation. What he found made his stomach sink. The videos were indeed spreading rapidly across various platforms, but the narrative accompanying them was nothing like what he had expected. The headlines ranged from "Entitled Tourist Gets Instant Karma" to "Royal Guard Shows," "How to Handle Bullies" to "American Millionaire Humiliated by British Soldiers' Professionalism." The comments were even worse, with viewers from around the world expressing their admiration for the guard's restraint and their disgust at Marcus's behavior. One comment that particularly stung read, "This is exactly why Americans have such a bad reputation abroad. This guy thinks his money makes him better than everyone else, including soldiers who risk their lives for their country." Another added, "That guard showed more class in 5 minutes than this tourist has probably shown in his entire life." Marcus scrolled through hundreds of similar comments, each one driving home the reality that he had become an international symbol of ugly tourist behavior. His attempt to demonstrate his superiority had instead made him a laughingstock, and the video evidence made it impossible for him to maintain his victim narrative. Meanwhile, back at the palace, James was enjoying a well-deserved break in the guard's common room. News of the incident had spread throughout the military base, and he found himself receiving congratulations from soldiers across multiple regiments. Word had even reached some of the senior officers, who were impressed by his handling of a difficult situation. Colonel Harrison, the commanding officer responsible for palace security, called James into his office for a brief meeting. James expected a routine debriefing, but the colonel's first words surprised him. "Guardsman Morrison," the colonel said with a slight smile, "I understand you had quite an eventful morning. I've reviewed the security footage from multiple angles, and I want to commend you for your exceptional professionalism under pressure." James stood at attention, uncertain how to respond to the praise. "Thank you, sir. I simply maintained my post as instructed." "Indeed you did," the colonel replied. "But you did more than that. You represented the finest traditions of this regiment while dealing with a particularly challenging individual. The palace receives thousands of visitors every day, and most of them treat our soldiers with appropriate respect. But when someone crosses the line as dramatically as this tourist did, it's important that we respond appropriately." The colonel pulled up the security footage on his computer and showed James the incident from several different camera angles. "What's particularly impressive," he continued, "is that you managed to resolve the situation without ever technically leaving your post or engaging in any behavior that could be construed as aggressive. That takes exceptional judgment and self-control." James watched the footage with interest, seeing the encounter from perspectives he hadn't been able to observe during the actual event. The cameras clearly showed that he had remained within the bounds of his duty, while still managing to deflate Marcus's aggressive behavior. "Sir," James asked, "has there been any official complaint filed about the incident?" Colonel Harrison chuckled. "Oh yes, we received several calls this afternoon, but they weren't complaints about your behavior. They were from tourists who wanted to express their admiration for how you handled the situation." Apparently, quite a few people felt that the incident showed the British military in a very positive light. The colonel leaned back in his chair and became more serious. "James, I want you to understand something important. What happened today wasn't just about one difficult tourist. It was about upholding the dignity and reputation of the Queen's Guard in front of an international audience. Every person who witnessed that confrontation, and everyone who sees the videos online, will form opinions about British military professionalism based on how you conducted yourself." James nodded, beginning to understand the broader implications of what had occurred. "I hadn't thought about it that way, sir." "That's exactly why you handled it so well," the colonel replied. "You weren't thinking about public relations or viral videos. You were simply doing your duty with honor and integrity. That authenticity is what made your response so powerful." Back at the cafe, Marcus was still scrolling through the increasingly harsh commentary about his behavior. Sarah had been watching him quietly, and she could see the exact moment when the full weight of the situation finally hit him. "This is really bad, isn't it?" he asked, though the question was more of a statement. "It's not great," Sarah admitted, "but it's not necessarily permanent damage. The internet has a short memory if you handle this correctly." Marcus looked up from his phone, desperate for any suggestion that might help salvage his reputation. "What do you mean?" "Well," Sarah said carefully, "you could acknowledge that you made a mistake. Maybe make a public apology that shows you understand why people are upset. Sometimes taking responsibility can actually improve how people see you." But the suggestion of apologizing seemed to trigger Marcus's defensive instincts again. "Apologize for what?" "For expecting basic courtesy from a public employee. For standing up for myself when I was disrespected." Sarah realized that despite all the evidence, Marcus was still not ready to accept full responsibility for what had happened. His ego and his worldview were too deeply invested in seeing himself as the wronged party to allow for genuine self-reflection. 3 weeks had passed since the incident at Buckingham Palace, and the ripple effects were still being felt across multiple continents. The video had indeed gone viral, accumulating millions of views across various social media platforms and spawning countless reaction videos, memes, and commentary pieces about entitled tourist behavior and military professionalism. Marcus returned to his Manhattan penthouse to find that his carefully constructed reputation had taken a significant hit. Business associates who had once eagerly courted his investment dollars were now hesitant to be publicly associated with him. His exclusive country club had received numerous complaints from members who were embarrassed by his behavior, and several high-profile charity organizations had quietly removed him from their donor recognition lists. The tech investment firm that Marcus had built over 2 decades was experiencing unexpected challenges. Potential business partners were reluctant to engage with someone who had become synonymous with ugly American tourist behavior. His company's stock price had dropped several points, not due to any fundamental business problems, but because investors were concerned about the reputational damage. Marcus sat in his corner office, staring out at the New York skyline while his assistant briefed him on the mounting public relations crisis. Media outlets were requesting interviews, but his legal team had advised against any public statements until the online furor died down. "Mr. Wellington," his assistant said nervously, "there's been another development. The British Embassy has received over 3,000 letters and emails from people around the world, praising Guardsman Morrison's professionalism. They're planning to present him with a special commendation for representing British military values under difficult circumstances." Marcus felt his jaw clench at this news. Not only had his attempt to humiliate the Guard failed spectacularly, but James was now being celebrated as a hero. The irony was almost unbearable. His effort to demonstrate his own importance had instead elevated a soldier he had tried to diminish. Meanwhile, in London, James was struggling to adapt to his unexpected fame. The video had made him recognizable to tourists from around the world, and his duties at the palace had become more challenging as visitors specifically sought him out for photos and conversations. The military had assigned additional security to manage the crowds that gathered around his post. Colonel Harrison called James into his office again, this time to discuss a unique opportunity that had emerged from the incident. "James," he said, "we've received an invitation for you to speak at the Royal Military Academy about maintaining military bearing under pressure. Your handling of that situation has become something of a case study in military professionalism." James was honored by the invitation, but also somewhat overwhelmed by the attention. "Sir, I appreciate the recognition, but I was just doing my job. Any guardsman would have handled it the same way." "That's exactly the kind of humility that made your response so powerful," the colonel replied. "You didn't seek attention or try to make the incident about yourself. You simply upheld the standards of your position with dignity and restraint." The colonel handed James a folder containing letters and emails from around the world. "These are just a small sample of the messages we've received. People from dozens of countries have written to express their admiration for how you conducted yourself. Many of them are from veterans who recognize the discipline required to maintain composure under such provocation." James opened the folder and began reading some of the letters. One was from an elderly American veteran who wrote, "Your behavior reminded me why I was proud to serve my country. In an age when respect and honor sometimes seem forgotten, you showed the world that these values still matter." Another letter came from a British family whose young son had witnessed the incident. "Our 8-year-old son has been talking about the brave soldier at the palace for weeks. He says he wants to be like you when he grows up, someone who stays calm and does the right thing even when others are being mean." Back in New York, Marcus was finally beginning to confront the reality of what his behavior had cost him. His daughter, who was studying at Columbia University, had called to express her embarrassment about the viral video. Several of his oldest friends had gently suggested that he might benefit from taking some time for self-reflection. The breaking point came when Marcus received a call from his elderly mother in Ohio. She had seen the video and was deeply disappointed in her son's behavior. "Marcus," she said in the voice that had guided him through childhood, "I raised you better than that. That young soldier was just doing his job and you treated him terribly." For the first time since the incident, Marcus felt genuine shame rather than defensive anger. His mother's words cut through all the justifications and excuses he had been constructing, forcing him to see his actions through the eyes of someone who loved him unconditionally, but refused to enable his poor behavior. That evening, Marcus sat alone in his penthouse watching the viral video one more time. But instead of looking for evidence to support his victim narrative, he tried to see the encounter objectively. What he saw was a successful businessman behaving like a spoiled child, attempting to use wealth and privilege to humiliate someone who had dedicated his life to service. The guard's restraint and professionalism stood in stark contrast to his own petty aggression. Marcus realized that James had demonstrated more strength and character in 5 minutes than Marcus had shown in years of business success. The soldier had faced deliberate provocation with dignity, while Marcus had revealed himself to be someone who would attack others simply to feed his own ego. For the first time in his adult life, Marcus began to question the values that had driven his success. His wealth had indeed given him power and influence, but it had also isolated him from the basic human decency that the guard had displayed so effortlessly. Money had bought him luxury and comfort, but it had also corrupted his ability to treat others with respect. 3 months after the incident, Marcus made a decision that surprised everyone who knew him. He quietly reached out to the British Embassy and requested permission to send a personal letter to Guardsman Morrison. The letter was simple and direct. "Guardsman Morrison, I want to apologize for my behavior at Buckingham Palace. I was wrong to treat you with disrespect, and I was wrong to try to use my wealth to diminish your service to your country. You conducted yourself with honor and professionalism that I failed to show. I have learned from your example, and I hope to be a better person because of it. Thank you for your service. Marcus Wellington." The letter was forwarded through military channels and eventually reached James at his barracks. He read it twice, surprised by what seemed to be genuine remorse from someone he had written off as irredeemably arrogant. James showed the letter to his sergeant, who whistled in amazement. "Well, I'll be damned," Sergeant Williams said. Maybe there's hope for that tosser after all. The incident had taught both men valuable lessons, though in very different ways. For James, it had reinforced his commitment to the values that military service represented: honor, duty, and selfless dedication to something greater than oneself. For Marcus, it had been a painful but necessary education in humility and the true meaning of respect. The viral video continued to circulate online, serving as a reminder to viewers around the world about the importance of treating others with dignity, regardless of their position or profession. The story of the wealthy tourist and the royal guard had become more than just an entertainment. It had become a lesson in character, integrity, and the power of maintaining one's principles under pressure. In the end, the confrontation that Marcus had intended as a display of his superiority had instead revealed the profound difference between having power and having character. James Morrison had shown the world that true strength comes not from wealth or position, but from the courage to do what is right, even when faced with deliberate provocation. It was a lesson that resonated far beyond the stone walls of Buckingham Palace, touching lives across the globe and reminding people everywhere of the values that truly matter.